Greetings and salutations. Thank you for lending an ear to the Voice of the Times this Sunday, August 22, 2021. For today's editorial, Boost Public Spending for Economic Recovery. Downgrading the economic outlook for the year was hardly surprising, given the severity of the COVID-19 surge attributed to the Delta variant. This disappointing development stresses the urgency of an effective recovery plan. Recently, the Development Budget Coordination Committee adjusted its gross domestic product or GDP forecast to between 4% and 5% for 2021. This is the second adjustment from the original target of between 6.5% and 7.5%, which was reduced by a percentage point after Metro Manila and adjacent provinces were placed in a bubble. As many know, GDP contracted by 9.5% last year. People hope for a robust recovery this year and beyond, but a modest growth seems more realistic for now. The pandemic has created so much uncertainty, though, that even the prospect of a modest GDP growth could slip away if the government response is ineffective or not on point. The best way forward might be to boost spending, which may sound counterintuitive in a crisis, but this is anchored on the economic principle that capital begets capital. In the Philippines, though, the type of spending that drove rapid growth before the pandemic was consumption, which accounted for about 70% of GDP. The problem is that people are unable to spend these days because consumers are under quarantine. Meanwhile, many businesses have shuttered, and those still afloat are restricted in accommodating patrons in its establishments. So to fine-tune our suggestion, economic managers, along with those aspiring for public office next year, should consider ramping up government or public spending. More should be spent on infrastructure and other construction projects that have a high multiplier. According to sources citing the International Monetary Fund or IMF, developed countries tend to have a large share of public spending in its GDPs. In the United States, the largest economy in the world, public spending accounts for 35% of its GDP, and in countries with the highest level of public spending, including Finland, Belgium, and Denmark, the share is more than 50% of its respective GDPs. In developing countries, however, the share of public spending in GDP tends to be smaller. According to the same source citing the IMF, the share of public spending in the Philippine GDP is only 22%. Another source reports a lower figure, only 15.28% of GDP. On better way of spending, the Philippines, however, is unlikely to realize the gains from spending if the government favors funding programs and activities with low fiscal multipliers. Doleouts are a good example of this type of inferior spending. That kind of financial assistance contributes to consumer spending, which is already robust. And in a pandemic, the handouts are likely to be spent only on basic necessities, not on capital goods that can generate more wealth. On the other hand, investing in roads, new hospitals, or telecommunications infrastructure will create jobs and will also reinvigorate businesses that supply inputs to them. Moreover, the suppliers themselves may need more inventory and hire additional people in order to meet the demand generated by the type of public spending given in this example. Such spending might even attract more investments from the private sector. Simply put, this is how spending on high multipliers work. Capital goods create more capital. Regretfully, politicians tend to favor giving doleouts to people not only during hard times, but particularly in an election season. Populism may help political aspirants get elected, but will unlikely result in the economic recovery that this country needs. COVID-19 exposed the areas that have suffered from underspending in the past. For instance, more investments were needed to improve internet speed, which could have blunted the impact of lockdowns. And before the pandemic, the Philippines needed more roads and other basic infrastructure, as well as power supply and healthcare systems, among other things. To summarize, economic managers and policymakers should consider the possibility that the Philippines may need to spend its way out of the rut created by the pandemic. But if populism prevails, this remedy may add to the burden. And that's the editorial for Sunday, August 22, 2021. For more news and information, get a copy of the Manila Times on print. Subscribe to our digital edition or log on to www.manilatimes.net. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and listen to the Voice of the Times.